up to Darwin, we have a philosophy of the head. We have a mind system being developed that's already alienating itself from God. And then right there at the time that Darwin comes along, here comes Karl Marx. Now he takes it into the real world and says, wait a minute, let's take it into a political, economical structure and let's get concrete about this. You know, it's interesting because Karl Marx wanted to dedicate his book Das Kapital to Charles Darwin. But of course, sometimes our wives are wiser than we are, and Darwin's wife said, "No, honey, you can't do that." And Charles Darwin declined. But Karl Marx relied deeply, strongly on Darwin's ideas. Then the German nationalism came, the French rationalism came, and from the mixture of both popped up the Humanist Manifesto with the Communist Manifesto right along with it. You see, the Humanist Manifesto gave you the intellectual side of alienation from God. The Communist Manifesto gave you the political, economic side of alienation from God. And both are saying we don't need God. So we have this happening already in history at this point. And guess what? Thomas Henry Huxley comes along. By the way, he's the one that termed the term agnostic. He says we can't prove God exists or doesn't exist. Each man in his own dialectic has to decide for himself. And of course, as this is happening, Mr. Friedrich Nietzsche shows up in history, 1844 to 1900. And this is the one man who shamelessly, ruthlessly, and absolutely with no remorse and taking his viewpoint to its ultimate conclusion, attacks Christianity and God, Friedrich Nietzsche. He declared the death of God. He declared the deity of man. He called man the Übermensch, or the Superman. And he replaced the word morality. Now catch this one. He replaced the word morality with the word values. You know why? Because morality has an eternal point of reference. Values has a concrete human social point of reference. And that's the word we hear these days, values. Well, the author is Friedrich Nietzsche. It's interesting that Nietzsche spent the 11 last years of his life totally insane. He would sign his letters, the Christ. Amazing. And it's also interesting when you think about Nietzsche. He's the one, he was Hitler's favorite book. He read Nietzsche all the time. And he loved the concept of the Superman. In fact, Hitler is the one who attempted, like Nietzsche suggested, to make the ideology that Nietzsche had into an actual world reality. The Superman exists. The Superman is ruthless. The Superman has no compassion. The Superman is brutal. And the Superman goes through with his ideology, even if it means national suicide. He's not a coward. If his destiny is self-destruction, then Superman must proceed. It's a shame because that explains why in Hitler's last stand, the only thing he had fighting for him, the only troops that were fighting for him, were children from 9 to 12 years old. The Stalinist army was horrified when they finally broke the last barricade, and they saw children on the ground. And they were just so horrified, they broke into panic, tears, trying to revive these little boys. They couldn't believe they had been fighting children. It was hard. But you see, that was the philosophy of the Superman. And Hitler himself had written, and he said, I will. Give me the education. Give me the government. Give me the media. And I will produce a nation of heartless, ruthless men without heartless. He says, I will produce these machines out of youth, and Germany will conquer the world. And that's what we got from this. And then while this is going on, Sigmund Freud appears in history, the architect of atheistic psychoanalytics, and he also praised Darwin. And then, of course, into this century, the last century, 1905 to 1980, we had Jean-Paul Sartre. He was a novelist and a writer. Did you know, by the way, that the conquering of the 20th century was done through the mediums of entertainment and art? Did you know that? You see, art and entertainment are expressions of the deepest type of philosophies a man can have. You know, the actual shift that we had in America, the great shift that we had in the foundations of America occurred in the 60s. And it's amazing how, like with just pulverizing speed, from the 60s till today, we saw a nation just take a total, absolute turn in the reverse direction. 190-degree angles. Right away, and diametrically opposed to what it believed till then. We saw this happening in history. Jean-Paul Sartre expressed three things in his writings. First of all was, life is meaningless. Second, man is worthless. Third, all is passion. He lived it out to his dying day. He died an alcoholic. We have this as a legacy to what a post-Christian era is. These post-Christian intellectuals gave us the modern mind. We had that phase of despair, the alienation from God, when Galileo said the universe is not geocentric, therefore man is insignificant. This is a contradiction. This is not logic. Because of the position of the earth as a physical entity did not determine the inner worth of a human being. And Darwin, of course, said that life is accidental and man is meaningless. Marx again said there is no God. Man must create his own paradise, from whence we have the idea of utopia. And Freud said religion is a delusion. Man is a creature of illusions. And Nietzsche said God is dead. Man must become God. You know, it reminds me of the graffiti on a wall in New York. Someone put on the wall, God is dead, Nietzsche. And then underneath it said, Nietzsche's dead, God. It was, again, God has a sense of humor. So you see, according to the philosophical structure of society, God was dead on arrival in the 20th century, and the 20th century was doomed to chaos and despair. It was Nietzsche who said, I call Christianity the one great curse, the one innermost perversion, the one great instinct of revenge, for which no means are too venomous too underhanded, too underground, too petty. And Bertrand Russell, with his famous book, Why I'm Not a Christian, giving all types of supposed intellectual, psychological, medical reasons why Christianity is harmful. Of course, he never told the truth that he was a prolific man. He lived in total dissipation. He seduced the daughters of his friends, committed multiple adulteries, and died of all sorts of diseases in one body. Of course, you didn't get that in his intellectual book. He's not going to tell you. And there's a book written by Paul Johnson that's called Intellectuals, and that book is a good one to also read, because one thing you get from this book, and it's this message, all these intellectuals that brought the alienation from God, that brought the coronation of a godless man, that brought chaos into society, these men, each and every one of their lives are no point of reference for happiness and fulfillment. Every one of them died miserable, lived completely without any sense of worth or meaning. So next time somebody quotes Plato to you or Socrates, remember, these men and their knowledge was self-derived, therefore subject to error and change, therefore unreliable. Philosophy, humanism, says man is the measure of all things, from definitions to culture to destiny. Its social structure, secularism, the non ultra, none other. All is here, all is now, all is world. The consequences are secularization, pluralization, privatization, existential relativism. And Hitler, who was, as we said before, influenced by Nietzsche, vowed to produce that new world. And of course, we saw how it ended. And relativism, the result of all this, is nothing other, and it's simply just another word for anarchy. Relativism it does not use any reasoning. It discards logic. The only point of reference is what the self prefers. The abolition of humanity, secularization, has left society without a point of reference for decency. Pluralization has deprived society of reason and has left no point of reference for rationality. Privatization, the consequence of both, has left the individual without meaning and with no point of reference for coherence. Secularization has caused us to lose our sense of shame, generating evil toward those we love. You know, kids aren't afraid to steal from mom and dad anymore. Moms and dads aren't afraid to hurt their children anymore. They have no sense of compassion. Pluralization led us to the loss of reason, generating evil towards others groundlessly. Heard of Columbine? I have. Privatization stripped us of meaning, generating evil against ourselves. We have three things happening when we do that. We have self-desecration, which is the loss of identity. We have self-hatred, which is the loss of worth. And we have self-destruction, the loss of life. When you speak of the losses here, the loss of identity, the loss of worth and life, we have serious consequences. When a man loses his sense of identity, he loses all his lines of definition. That is why we live in a society where there is a loss of the sexes. Doesn't matter if you're man or woman anymore, you don't mean anything. And you have the loss of age distinction. That explains child pornography. And then you have the loss of hope. And who more can feel this than our youth? Our youth live in this desperate world. You recall the painting I showed you last night, the silent scream. The loss of hope. Kids turn to drugs and alcohol. It is an existential method of trying to find some sense of worth, even if it means feeling something, though it may be meaningless, but you want to feel something and know that I'm here. So I'll take a drug, and if it doesn't work, then forget it. I'll just kill myself and end it all. The four categories of life must be defined coherently. Origin, meaning, morality, destiny. They have to be defined coherently. They have to go together. They go together, or they fall apart together. You take one of these out, and you have nothing. You have nothing. Your life is incoherent. Your philosophy is incoherent. It is meaningless. You know, there's a movie. I didn't see it, but I read some things on it. But there's a movie called Pulp Fiction. There's two characters in there named Vincent and Jules, and they're en route to commit murder. But you know, while they're going out here, they're about to commit multiple murder, and they're in there with carefree talk and laughter. And their rapport is meaningless. They're talking about hamburgers, cokes, and this and that, and meaningless. And a lot of people don't understand what that means. They don't realize what that means. And they say, well, what kind of script is that? Well, the script is relevant. The script means everything, because what you have here, it is a language that conforms to the human condition. Life is meaningless. Act like it. Talk like it. And that's what you get out of these modern movies. They're relating the message. They're relating. Necessary truths. We have to understand that there are necessary truths for a coherent, integral, harmonious existence. One, there is an absolute. An absolute is an unchanging point of reference by which all progress is measured. An absolute is an unchanging point of reference by which all progress is measured. Truth is a coherent category. Truth corresponds reality. Whatever corresponds consistently to reality fits into a coherent system. And it provides a coherent foundation upon which to build a dependable world view from which to make reliable choices for living. As we see this, I want to point you to a couple of passages. The first one is in John chapter 14. And notice how profound the words of the Lord Jesus Christ are. In John chapter 14, in verse 1, and I want us to feel the impact of these words, having considered the things we have considered. Notice verse 1. Let not your heart be troubled. You believe in God, believe also in me. And verse 6, he says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. That is coherence. You have it all. You're not going to be mistaken about that. It's not going to confuse you. It gives you meaning. It gives you worth. It gives you the answers. Origin, meaning, morality, and destiny. You have them all there. It's all in Jesus Christ. He is the perfect point of reference. Any modification or change of the necessary truth for coherence is certain to disintegrate and end in disaster. You see, the Bible has never lied. If you go there to Galatians chapter 6 with me, in Galatians chapter 6, you notice here what the Apostle Paul says, and he is relating a moral reality here. This is one of God's laws, that if we violate, we will suffer the consequences of the violation. He says here in Galatians chapter 6 verse 7, be not deceived, God is not mocked, for whatever a man soweth, that shall he also reap. For he that soweth to his flesh shall of the flesh reap corruption. He that soweth to the Spirit shall of the Spirit reap everlasting life. May I suggest to you that our society, our modern thinkers, with all their philosophies and reasoning, have all sowed to the flesh, and we are reaping the fruits of the flesh. Philosophical terms carry some serious consequences. We had the separation, God's universals. Nature had the particular. God's universals are those overruling moral laws that he has left for us, the categorical instructions that we find in the Bible. The nature simply is the particulars which are dependent upon those. That is, creation depends on what God has placed for us to operate in and the things that he has told us to live by. And once we leave those, we have a serious problem. God has laid the category. God is the superintendent. He governs. He's sovereign. Man also is given the work of submission to God, yet he's superintendent and he governs the animal and the plant life, and from there he also creates the machine world. But all this must be in a coherent existence. When we start breaking these up, dissolving them, we have a problem. Here in this historical synthesis, as I call it, there is necessity of divine intervention. That is, without God revealing and intervening, we have nothing. God, his grace, his supernatural power has been able to help his creation, nature, and human historical progress. I put here, we have the natural unfolding of existing personal nature through history. We have the worldviews of pagan nations. They have always either been fatalistic or deterministic, but they go nowhere until God comes. He spoke through Judaism, and then he came in the times of the Caesars with Christianity. He brought in what would be called a transition, a transformation, a lifting out of this pagan world. And although the pagan world is still existing, God has introduced a supernatural reality into this world. That entity is called the church, the Lord's body. And even at that point, when you have the church, you have the New Testament, you have spirituality, you have coherence. The enlightenment of the Western world caused the decline. We saw historically, apostasy came in, unbelief came in, atheism came in, deterministic deism came in, which was a reaction to the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, and of course existentialism and humanism became prominent. And once you had that, we now have relativism, we have neo-paganism, we have hedonism, we have incoherence in this world. And we need to understand this, because it's so important to know that these are the things that we are facing as a people and a nation. It's important that we understand that. Tomorrow we will go into a more specific area, which is specifically where we are concerned as God's people. We will speak tomorrow of what I've called the last part 3, the secular Christian. And we're going to talk about what that means and where it came from and why. And what we need to do to face up to these things and please the Lord our God and not be deviated or deceived. But what the modern world has been taken by these deceptions that have occurred in the world. As we read in our text, it says, don't be deceived. Let no one rob you through vain philosophy, pointless, destructive philosophy. Remember this, that the existential consequences of what came along was alienation. And you see it all around you. Alienation from God, alienation from nature, alienation from self, alienation from government through educational and medical and ecclesiastical institutions. No one believes in any of these institutions anymore. We need to understand this because it's so important to know that these are the things that we are facing as a people and a nation. It's important that we understand that. Tomorrow we will go into a more specific area. And of course, because of this, the rise of the New Age philosophy, the modern mysticism, paganism, as we saw the cycle of history yesterday, paganism comes around again. God created the church. God made us anew. See, we don't belong to this pagan world. We are His. We're born-again creatures. We are spiritual entities. We have something the world out there does not and cannot have unless we help them to see it. It's unfortunate and sad that we have to deal with these things, and sometimes we don't even know how because we don't know where it's coming from. The saddest thing to hear is when your kid comes home from college and says, Dad, we're talking homosexuality in school, and I don't know what to say. And you say, well, 1 Corinthians says, and Genesis, and here, all these things, and the young man says, that doesn't work in school. Do you have anything you can really help me with? And Dad says, well, no, I can't, son. I can't. If you don't believe the Bible, there's nothing I can do. Well, there is something we can do, and we're doing it right now. We're understanding what it's all about. Thank you for attention. God bless you. And it's important, as I have been emphasizing, that these are philosophical views that we've mentioned. Unfortunately, they've had such effect in our world that today's society is easily and clearly connected as a consequence of the collision of these worldviews. But we must remember that these are human philosophies. And as we've said, they're subject to change and to error. And usually when philosophical postulations have no definite point of reference, they usually tend toward error and falsehood. And unfortunately, we find ourselves dwelling in this type of situation with those that have invaded our modern secular society with their concepts. As we said in our journey, that we saw these people, these important men coming up in society, culminating in our modern secular worldview. The biggest contributor, of course, being to our modern education, John Dewey, who also had a humanistic, atheistic worldview. And from there we produced a lot of our political concepts from such people as himself, and in the area of psychology and sociology, B.F. Skinner, who was also one of them. Yes, sir. And so we'll finish off by this. I want to read something to you that I wrote, and I write it because of the specifics that I want to point out in it. I've called it The Abolition of Faith, and I begin by mentioning the novelist Mark Twain. Mark Twain wrote a book when he wrote a book, he was ingenious. And he had an ingenious way of expressing his worldview within the context of human affairs. He was so profoundly perceptive that in his contextualizing, he actually was able to insert his beliefs as a expressive in the lives of the characters he chose to portray. When he wrote the book Huckleberry Finn, there's a part in there that he relates that Huck is sitting there by the riverside with his friend Jim, and he realizes all of a sudden he feels that strong guilt that Jim is a runaway slave. And then he understands what he has to do, that he has to sit down and do something because his conscience is bothering him. So he sits down, takes a broken pencil, and writes a letter to Mrs. Watson to let her know where her runaway slave is. And then he sits there and as the book relates, he feels cleansed. He feels redeemed. And he's so glad that he's actually done this, and he doesn't have to go to hell anymore. And that he just feels so good about it. And he holds the letter in his hand, and then he lifts his eyes and he looks around and he sees Jim running around, and he sees the river, the waters, the flowers, and he smells the wonderful air, and he thinks of the fun that they've had so far, and he knows that this is a relationship and a life that he really loves. And so now he's caught between a serious decision. And he looks at his paper and he looks at Jim and he's looking back and forth, and he knows that whatever decision he makes now, it will be one of eternal proportions. And as the book says, Huckleberry says, well, I'll go to hell then. And he wads up the letter and throws it away. That's the state of modern society today. Modern society has known the things of God. It has known what God has said. It knows what God expects. It knew the Lord Jesus Christ, and it divorced the Lord Jesus Christ. It chose its destiny as a society. And that's where America is at. That's why we lived in what was transferred from the Renaissance to the Enlightenment into secularism. And secularism is really what's called the society that has chosen to divorce and abandon God. It's a society that we now call neo-paganism. Because we have abandoned God, we have chosen anew to revert back to the paganistic, mystical, cultic concepts that we once had. And that's why I had shown you or spoken to you about the cycle of the societal worldviews that come as pagan societies divulge. Now, it's important that we know this, because now we're in modern America. We're seeing that modern America, it's much more difficult to reach people. Just today I was overhearing a lady, an educated woman in the community which I live, speaking to someone else, and she had a rock, and she says, you know, rocks were here millions of years before we were, and they'll be here millions of years after we're gone. And I said, well, I thought to myself, I said, that's a worldview. That's a worldview. But we must remember something. Regardless of her statement, any worldview that places man as a meaningless existence is no worldview at all. It means absolutely nothing. You take man out of the universe and you have nothing. Because man is the only thing in the universe with the intellectual and moral capacity to find value in the universe. I've never heard a cat or a cow or an ape give a lecture on the aesthetics of trees and rivers. I've never seen a dolphin design or engineer a building or a car. I've never even heard them have any type of meaningful rapport among each other as far as animals are concerned. And neither do planets. It's interesting what we've come to. But it's as once some person said long ago, when we stop believing in God, we fall for anything. We believe in anything. And that's very unfortunate. I'd rather believe in God than end up believing in just anything that comes along. because it is the dignity of man to believe in something that has a firm foundation to it. It's important that we know it. Human existence in each generation has had to experience its own version of what we call the world. Every civilized state and culture was designed and organized by some type of force, and that's what we're going to talk about today. Let's read this 1 John chapter 2, verse 12 on. The apostle says this, I write unto you, little children, because your sins are forgiven you for his name's sake. I write unto you, fathers, because you have known him that is from the beginning. I write unto you, young men, because you have overcome the wicked one. I write unto you, little children, because you have known the Father. I have written unto you, fathers, because you have known him that is from the beginning. I have written unto you, young men, because you are strong, and the word of God abideth in you, and you have overcome the wicked one. Love not the world, neither the things that are in the world. If any man love the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For all that is in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eye, and the pride of life is not of the Father, but is of the world. And the world passeth away, and the lust thereof, but he that doeth the will of God abideth forever. Chapter 5, the same letter, verse 19. And we know that we are of God, and that the whole world lieth in wickedness, or the wicked one, as some have translated it. The world is under the power by an organized, designed, unseen, undetected spiritual force. Ephesians chapter 2, verses 1 to 3 informs us that the people in this world follow the course of this world that is under the influence, the power of the principality that rules the air or the atmosphere, the unseen dimensions of this world. And it is not a silly statement, because our geometrical and our algebraic equations demonstrate to us that we live in a reality that serves more than just three dimensions. Most of our thinking, most of our calculating is done in a separate dimension. And that dimension is what determines what occurs in the physical dimension. You see, it's amazing. You conjure up a car in your mind, and it results in the three-dimensional world, and yet the mind is operating in another dimension. And the biggest, strongest proof to anyone is your basic atom. The atom is an unseen power. No one has ever seen an atom, because atoms are invisible. But you know they're there. We've seen the effects of it. Split an atom, don't be too close to it. It's going to cause some serious damage, and yet it's invisible. Hebrews 11, 1 to 3 tells us that the things that are made were made from those things that we do not see, dependent upon the atomic existence. As we see this, then, we say that we as Christians must face what the world has always been there, and yet the world has some force in it that is ruling it, that is running it, organizing it. What I have here is a focus on these circles that I put here. What I'm representing here with this model is we have, each circle represents a particular specific civilization in history. But each civilization carried its version of the world. Each civilization carried its culture, its politics, its social, religious stratosphere. It carried all these things. You have Egypt, you have Babylon, we had Greece, we had Rome, we had the Dark Ages, the Renaissance age, and of course we are now in secular humanism. But throughout all these civilizations, God's people have walked the earth. That's why down here in the lower part of it I put Hebrews during Egypt, Israel during Babylon, Jews during Greece, Christians during Rome, and of course I put the apostasy under Dark Ages, but yet there were Christians in those days. And in the Reformation and Restoration during the Renaissance and Enlightenment. And what I put under secular humanism is what we're going to talk about, which is either a simulation or preservation. And there's where we come in today. Today's battle, from the collision of worldview, today's battle is the battle for the mind. There is a battle for the mind, and it's going on, it's happening in this unseen atmosphere. And there are agents involved in that. The people of God are the only ones that seem to be aware of this battle at this point. The source of the antagonism is spiritual entities. There is a spiritual warfare going on. Follow me to the letter of Ephesians in chapter 6, and we're going to read there. And verse 10, Ephesians 6, verse 10, the Apostle Paul says, "Finally, my brethren, be strong in the Lord and in the power of his might. Put on the whole armor of God, that you may be able to stand against the wiles of the devil. For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places." This passage outlines to us the structure of the unseen organized world that is set diametrically against God's truth and against our souls. Satan has an organized kingdom, as it's called in the Bible, and it's organized to deceive. Satan's agents, they are agents of evil. They are invisible invaders directing the affairs of the world through deceptive means, deceptive influence. And Satan's masterpiece in the last 3 centuries has been the greatest deception, the deception to convince unbelievers that he does not exist. And you know, you're easy prey to an invisible enemy, especially if you don't think he's there. And that's been his masterpiece throughout the last 3 centuries. They are agents of evil. I went and I broke down this text here, Ephesians 6:12, and I looked at these words. The word principality, archos, means rulers. And when we speak of the archos or rulers, these are the agents that influence kings and presidents in an organized manner. It also speaks of powers, exousias. These are delegated authorities. These are the agents that influence governments. And then we have the term rulers, cosmos kratos, which means these are influential world masters. These are the cultural molding mediums. And in the term spiritual wickedness, they really have the grammatical structure that means these are agents. These are active influences, spirits of evil sway. These are the agents involved in our signs. They are the deceivers of the masses, the deceivers of the common people who follow various kinds of cultural and religious trends. These are the ones that promote. These are the ones that perpetuate, as I put in the middle here, darkness throughout human history. And it's organized. And Jesus Christ himself said there in Matthew chapter 12, and I believe verses about 23 to 26, that Satan is not divided. It says, How can Satan cast out Satan? If Satan were divided, how would his kingdom endure? So you see, even Christ told us that Satan is organized. And he's at work. He doesn't quit. We have to understand this is the world that we're facing. These are the invisible forces that surround us all the time. But that's the world version of the world, and the agents are at work. But for Christians have the personal version of the world to battle. The personal version of the world that every Christian has to fight. In John 17:11, 14 to 16, Jesus prays for his followers. He says, Lord, they're in the world, but they're not of the world. I pray that you keep them from the world. What does that mean? He's saying, Father, help them not to be caught up by the trends and the social movements and become identified with these. Preserve them. Don't let them assimilate. Keep them unique. Keep them distinguished. Keep them as you planned for them to be. And yet we have the battle with personal prosperity and peace. We have to fight the flesh, the source of the emotional corporeal appetites. When these dominate, the drive force of the individual are his physical and emotional passions. We have the battle with the lust of the eyes, the gate of mental perception, the prime source for observing and interpreting the physical environment. God designed the eyes to be used to learn, to discern, to evaluate the external physical data so as to attribute significance and meaning and derive internal value in the heart by which to develop moral, practical character. And then the vainglory of life, of course, the prestigious pride of life, the personal glory, the personal esteem, the advantage, the fame based on world values, on the world system. The vainglory seeks prestige and power over others. It boasts and is arrogant. And its motive is, the only motive behind all that it does is self-aggrandizement, self-promotion, and praise from others. The vainglory of the world. Then the other aspect, the personal version of the world, is personal autonomy. That is self-will and independence. It is an attitude that says, I chart my own destiny. I don't need anyone. It's my life. I do as I please. Jeremiah 10:23 says, it is not in the way of man to direct his steps. So obey the Lord. The invasion of the secular world is as accessible to the Christian as it is to anyone else. When we look at our education, we look at the media, the film and the television industry, we look at the music industry, the art, the trends, the companions. These are accesses to our minds by those agents which control or influence these people and these things. You see, behind every movie, there's a scriptwriter. Behind every song, there's a songwriter. Behind every trend, there's a designer. And every one of these human beings have personal worldviews. And those worldviews, if they're not Christian, are directed and influenced by these deceiving spiritual agents that are in the world. And we have the antinomianism that even invades the Christian life. It is a moral synthesis. We have the moral synthesis of antinomianism for the Christian is we have a spiritual ethics, as we call it. We have knowledge minus virtue equal personal values. What does that mean? It means that it becomes our moral norm to produce our own moral ethics, and we commit moral desecration. We have religious convictions, but it's only in the head. And we have religious commitment, but it's only designated to particular environments. And we have religious service, but it's only a social hobby. But there is no coherence, you see. And because of this, we have what we call a dichotomy in the Christian life. We say one thing, we do the other. We behave this way at church, and we behave this way at school or at work. And that by itself produces a code of silence for the Christian. You never speak on religious issues in secular circles. Never speak on religious issues in secular circles. That's a code of silence for the secular Christian. A Christian that has been assimilated into the world. It is important that we understand this because it has escalated and it will continue to escalate or invade the church. Personal peace to the secular Christian means to be left alone, not to be troubled with the troubles of others, whether across town or across the world. No disturbance at all. Prosperity means a life of things, comfort, and gain. And secularism produces a society of unprincipled, materialist hedonists, people who live for nothing but pleasure. And Christians who traffic in unlived truth are the byproducts of a godless system. And we must remember something. Stigma forfeits any dogma. It doesn't matter how good your beliefs are. It doesn't matter how logical your reasoning is by on the things you believe religiously. If your life does not correspond, you're wasting your time. Stigma forfeits any dogma. And it's important that we understand this. I wrote something here on the secular Christian. For postmodern Christian America, even in religious circles, there is, for the most part, no longer a Christian mentality. There is, of course, a Christian ethic, a Christian practice, and a Christian moral being. The Christian subscribes to a code different from that of the non-Christian. As a church member, he understands his obligations and observes things that mean nothing to the non-Christian. He prays, he meditates, he tries to live as the non-Christian does or does not. But as a thinking being, the modern Christian has succumbed to secularism. His religion, morality, worship, and devotional life are segregated from his secular social life and isolated. He works and lives side by side by the non-Christian. He talks of plans, politics, economics, family, weather, etc., and not once in a religious context. It is an absolutely secular relationship void of spiritual integrity. The Christian slowly divests himself of the habit and practice of thinking spiritually and is seduced into a secular mentality, observing, speaking, judging, and acting on a secular, non-spiritual sublevel. The secular Christian has become a pragmatic schizophrenic who revolves back and forth between two opposing worldviews and mental states. To be a Christian is to abandon the mind and distort reality. Personal worldliness is the state in which our thought, reasoning, and our affections, with all our aspirations, are governed and directed by the world culture and its philosophies, or the zeitgeist, time spirit, the spirit of the age. This kind of Christian lives in two contrary compartments. Intellectually, he understands what spirituality is. Pragmatically, he identifies with the social trends of modernism. As we have been sufficiently admonished by scriptures, we need to understand we cannot afford to lose our perspective as Christians. There is no compromise. The church is the only influential and spiritual means to reach this world. And the church is comprised of each and every member. And it's important that we understand, has secularism invaded my thinking, my life? We must reclaim a coherent worldview. We have become personally responsible, and we must become informed on world issues. This is where today's battle is being fought, in the area of worldview. That's where it's all being fought. As C.S. Lewis said, to be ignorant and simple now, not to be able to meet the enemies on their own ground, would be to throw down our weapons and betray our uneducated brethren, who under God have no defense but us against the intellectual heathen. Good philosophy must exist, if for no other reason, because bad philosophy needs to be answered. That's the battle of worldviews. We must provide sufficient reason why we believe God does exist and has spoken, if we are to survive spiritually and convert the world. We must equip our children with an adequate education and strong spiritual training to meet the challenges of modern atheistic academia. Islam trains thousands of scholars every year specifically to destroy the Christian belief and worldview. They have schools that train them just for that purpose. We must attempt great things for God. We must focus on total revival, on radical revival, radical obedience to God. We need a resurrection of faith. We need a resurrection of the truth. We need to reinstate an absolute point of reference, God and His Word.